Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Let's check in with Philip Cross. He is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute think tank, and we'll talk about the economic issues facing Canada. Philip, thanks again for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back, Tony.
I guess recently you wrote about the concept of greedflation as a political weapon against certain companies. What did you conclude?
Well, I concluded there's two things wrong with it. One is the theory, which is why, after 30 years of dormant inflation, did companies suddenly wake up last year and discover they had this pricing power that evidently they had but didn't use for 30 years, and they suddenly decided to use last year. So, that's never explained. But the practice, too, is that, clearly firms don't like inflation. The business community doesn't like inflation. You look at what's happened to stock market valuations over the last year. In Canada and throughout the world, stock markets have fallen sharply. We saw this before the 1970s. Stock markets took a horrible beating in the 1970s. So very clearly, the business community and financial markets do not think that inflation is good for profits. So there's no evidence for it. In fact, the evidence is just the opposite. Inflation hurts firms just as it hurts households. The only group in our society that profits from inflation clearly is government. They've made money hand over fist. Revenues have been way above what was expected.
Yeah, to unpack that a little bit for our audience, because that was another point that you made in the article.
Well, just that, governments, particularly at a time following a period of great debts, whether it's after a war or in this case, a pandemic, when we had huge debts, an easy way, the most obvious way for governments to reduce the burden of that debt is to increase in prices, increase inflation. Historically, that's what's happened after major shocks to government finances, and that's what's happened again this time. So I don't think it's a complete surprise that governments turn to either willingly or unwillingly allowed prices to rise much faster, and central banks were extremely slow. I mean, they were in denial for several months. They said, first of all, inflation doesn't exist. Then they said, well, it's very transitory. It'll go away in a couple of months. Then they said, well, it's a supply side phenomenon. It's not due to all the stimulus we injected into demand through very easy monetary policy and very large deficits. And finally, they had to admit, actually, it does seem to have something to do with the stimulative policy, and culminating today with yet another increase in the Bank of Canada interest rate.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What's more pain for the consumer and for the borrower and for the mortgagee? So what do you see coming out of this?
Well, obviously, I think we're going to see a pronounced slowdown in the economy. I think we've already seen higher interest rates. And by the way, I should mention, too, a lot of people, particularly the left, have argued that high interest rates don't work against inflation. That's not true. They've worked every time in the past. They worked decisively in the 1980s. And they're clearly working this time. We've seen house prices, which was the most obvious example of inflation in Canada. Those have already started to back off substantially. Global financial commodity prices, particularly oil, have backed off as the global economy starts to slow down. So clearly, we're already seeing higher interest rates start to dampen inflation. What worries you is, you don't want to get caught while headline inflation is coming down. There's no signs yet that wages are coming down. And I think that's what really worries people. If we're going to bring interest rates down quickly and inflation down quickly, we have to make sure that this isn't the beginning of a wage price spiral. And I think the evidence is at best mixed. We see wages rising about 5%. If they continue to rise at 5%, inevitably service prices are going to start rising at 5%. And we're going to have to see more interest rate increases. But I think that's why the Bank of Canada today said, well, we're going to, hike rates today, and then we're going to take a pause. We're going to see what the effect of this in the economy is, and hopefully, we won't see a wage price spiral initiated, and everything will unfold as the bank hopes, which is that inflation will come down quickly. But as somebody mentioned, these guys have been so wrong throughout this whole pandemic. It's hard to have a lot of confidence in their forecast.
Indeed. Philip Cross, we're going to take a brief break for commercial. We'll be back after that.